I'm Gaurav Sinha. I'm a professor of geography here. I teach GIS. As our dean said, I guess someday I expect to have a Sinha shoal somewhere, probably, like the rest of you. I would like to thank actually, Jim Dyer, Dorothy, and the rest of the department. When we first, proposed this idea, Jim was right on board, and he floated the idea. Then we brought it up, and everybody supported it. That we should do something in Dr. Bloemer's honor. It's kind of it's a great coincidence that we found a keynote speaker in Dr. Mark, who's or David, as I learned to call him after several years, because he was my mentor on my PhD committee. It took me a long time to call him David because it's just a little too much to call him a first name. Given the immense respect I have, like you guys have for Hugh Bloemer. He spoke a lot on this area of how we think about landforms, how we name them, toponyms. It's perfect that we have him as the speaker rather than anybody else. I can't imagine anybody better to speak today than him. I can go on and on about him, and normally if my students know I don't stick to any script, but it's dangerous today, so I'm going to actually try to stick to something that I wrote down, and it's probably on the David Mark, he's one of the founding figures, I think, in this emerging field called GI science, which is sort of the theory behind GIS. Throughout his career, his interests have been pretty divergent, but he's worked on digital elevation models, he's worked in cognitive geography, wayfinding, navigation, a lot on geographic ontology, and he's one of the creators of this emerging new discipline called Ethnophysiography, which is all about how people conceptualize the landscape, in a very sort of a cultural way rather than a more computational or GIS way that we think about. Cultural differences, linguistic differences, that's what he's been working on for landscape features for a long time now. He's one of the most productive, creative, and people I know in geography. He has more than 225 publications. He's been cited for more than 10,000 times, which is, those of you who don't understand, how much citations, 10,000 is way beyond that most academics ever get to, actually. He has, received more than $17 million in funding over his career. He's founded two very influential, the top two conferences in the GIS community, GI science community, GI Science and COSIT. These are two leading conferences which are still going on, and he's been involved in getting it started. He was the director of one of the NCGIS centers, one of the prominent centers in GIS analysis that started in 1990. He was telling us a story today, and to me and Dr. Foley here at lunch. And one of the biggest things I think he's done as an educator is do the IGA program, which was something that I got involved with as an associate. And it was a very integrated, multidisciplinary approach to geographic education, especially in GIS. And as he was telling us, they funded over 60 PhD students. Not all of them finished, but a lot of them finished. And I think he solely was responsible for bringing them all together. A lot of faculty were involved, but nobody as deeply as him. He's been named Researcher of the Year in 2004 by the UCGIS. He was recognized as a UCGIS educator in 2009. He received the Distinguished Career Award from AG in 2013. He's actually a distinguished professor at SUNY, which is a state university in New York. It's the whole system. Very few people actually are. And more recently, in 2016, he was recognized as an outstanding alumnus by Simon Fraser University, where he got his PhD and his undergraduate. And he was also awarded the first Walter Tobler GI Science Prize by the Austrian Academy of Sciences. I should probably know all this by heart because I actually created his Wikipedia page as an honor to him when he retired. But I think I should stop and I should yield the floor to him. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thank you, Gaurav, and thanks to Ohio University for inviting me. This is actually perhaps strangely enough, considering how famous I am, this is the first time I've been invited to give a keynote in Geography Awareness Week anywhere. So I'm particularly honored and pleased to be here and to see colleagues, new colleagues, and friends, new friends as well. It is my research the last 20 or 25 years mostly is at least somewhat relevant to Hugh Bloemer Day and to the naming, and a lot of it is about how things in the landscape, entities in the landscape get named, and the sort of cultural and other constraints on naming. So, of course, I try to advance the slide and it doesn't. There we go, maybe. No. So I can't use the, we should have tested whether I could advance the slide.
There's a mouse that maybe that'll click.
What's a mouse? I haven't used a mouse in 30 years, probably.
Do it.
It's not on this computer. Sorry, technology. No place for wimps. Technology.
How does it change?
Well,
It won't plug into his computer?
He is on his computer.
so I might even. It won't even escape from the presentation mode here, and so we should have. But my cursor's over there, so I guess maybe I can just click on them over there.
Maybe.
Yeah. So, okay, so you're now seeing, but now there's the sort of mirroring. No. I want to do,
Second. Let me try something, David.
It's off screen now. There we go.
but what's up there is not quite.
What we want to do is choose your presentation mode.
So I could,
It's mirrored backwards.
Yeah.
This is supposed to be up there.
That is supposed to be.
So the mirroring.
so what
is
about,
reversed.
can we, this cursor is on here and swap displays.
Yeah.
You swap displays.
Yes.
Does that do it?
Yes. Now
Can I advance?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, so here's a lesson for those of you who will be doing PowerPoint or similar presentations in job interviews or as teachers, is that you should test not just whether the first slide shows up on the screen, but whether the system works, and maybe it's yeah, okay. Maybe it still won't work. Who thinks the third slide will come up when I, yes it did, okay. So this map, okay, so Bloemer Berg is a very it's an amazing honor. I've never actually been connected to or heard about the process of actually naming a feature after someone. And that is, I'm sure it took a lot of work and forms and permissions, and it was officially declared and has this sort of metadata and so on. Bloemer Berg is unique as far as I can tell from my searches in the Geographic Names Information System. This is the only official geographic feature name in the United States that has the generic word Berg in the name. And Berg is usually translated to mountain, although Dorothy said this was a hill. So what's going on with that? Are there any mountains in this part of Ohio? But Bloemer Berg, of course, is alliterative, so that's nice. And in fact, one of my points will relate. Berg is not particularly synonymous with mountain. The word Berg in German seems to apply to some things that I would call hills. The German word for hill is supposed to be Hügel, right? But it doesn't, Hügel doesn't get into toponyms in Germany very much. Most of the large rounded eminences are named Bergs, like the Uetliberg at Zurich. So I happen to have one research-related slide on this point. The word Berg is usually translated as mountain, but in Switzerland, the use of the word Berg to refer to features of the landscape today turns out to be different from how the word Berg is used in names of features. And this will come up again if I get that far in my planned presentation. This is a map done by Kurt and Derungs that shows the relative density of the word Berg in photo tags versus the word Berg in toponyms. And the yellow areas are places where there's a lot more eminences that are something Berg. The reddish part are places where the things are not named Berg, but when people put photographs into Flickr, they used Berg as the tag. And the reddish parts are the high Alps, tall, pointy, snowy mountains. I should have had a picture from ground level. In the northern part, such as around Zurich, lower altitude, colored green in this map, the hills, the features are rounded. There may be some of them 5,000 feet high, so we probably would think they should be called mountain, but they're not the craggy classic Swiss mountains. So this use of the word Berg in photo tags, picture of a Berg, versus the name of something being Uetliberg, is using different criteria, and their spatial distribution is, these colored areas are 20% more in one use than in the other use. Yellow is 20% more often in the names than it is in the tags, and the reddish is 20% more often in the tags than the names. Okay, and this is that's jumping way ahead. I'm going to, if I get that far, talk about these issues in more general terms and with a number of examples. So the title was Naming of Landscape Places and Features, Multilingual and Multicultural Perspectives. And of course I had like an hour or two to come up with a title that they could use here, you folks. So I rushed into that, but I think it's okay. Naming, there's two kinds of naming that I think are very important for landscape. One is toponyms, proper names, labels for things those are referential, versus landscape terms. See that mountain, see that hill, see that lake. And the terms that occur in ordinary writing, speech, discourse are not necessarily the ones that would appear inside the toponym. And the names in the toponym are not required to be truthful. So that you're not, in a way, a proper name is referential. And if my friend Jim Little doesn't have to be Little for that to be his name. Probably an ancestor 700 years ago was Little, and that's why they called that's why his surname came from. So in human surnames, it's pretty easy to realize that not all people named Cooper make barrows anymore. But these names that are based on professions have lived on, and the same sort of reasoning does apply to toponyms, and I'll talk more about that a little bit later. Landscape, I think of landscape as the larger or more distant aspects of the environment. Landscape is a very contested term with different subdisciplines of geography and different neighboring fields, ecology, architecture and planning, using landscape in different senses. We took a long time to, I edited a book, the cover will probably come up in a while, that was called Landscape in Language. I was one of 4 editors, and we wrote a chapter 1, and it took us a long time to negotiate the 3 or 4 pages talking about what the domain of the book is. What is landscape? What did we mean? And That's a topic I really won't have time, I think, to dig into unless it comes up in a question and discussion period or at the reception or whatever. And I'm very happy to receive emails asking me questions, follow-ups, and things like that. No phone calls, please, but emails, text messages, perhaps. Multilingual, I'll be picking out some results from studies I've been involved with, working with English, working with an Australian Aboriginal language called Yinjibarndi. That was the first field work I did on this topic. We've worked with Navajo terms for parts of the landscape or features. We did a study, I worked with Chen Chi-Fang on Bahasa Indonesia and Bahasa Malaysia languages, how they refer to mountains and hills. We had a case study with Swiss German that got into the issue of the generic part of the name is not always a word that you would use as a noun on its own. Multicultural makes the multilingual stuff complicated because you can't really vary the language but hold the culture constant. And when you get differences between speakers of different languages, it's not always easy to distinguish how much of it is due to the language difference itself. A lot of how landscape referencing works in Navajo is structural. The Navajo has a very complicated to us, restricted syntax for expressing things, and that constrains how a Navajo can talk about any language, and any domain, I mean. And it opens up possibilities that are more difficult for English. Okay, and I'll be fine if anybody wants to politely interrupt and ask a question or make a comment during the talk. And I'll finish up in the allotted time, even if I don't get to all of the slides. Landscape terms, they're common nouns or noun phrases that refer to types or kinds of features. So the examples that came up most frequently in some free listing tests that we did were mountain, lake, river, hill, valley. So these sorts of words have in English there's probably more than 100 words at least that have quite a bit more than 100, that have a primary meaning that refers to something in the landscape. So we use, I'm sure the president has a mountain of paperwork on his desk, or maybe it's not paper anymore, it's a mountain of incoming messages of some sort. So mountain gets used for other things, but most people would agree that the primary meaning of the word mountain is the landscape feature. That distinction doesn't happen nearly as much in the Australian Aboriginal languages that we've worked with. Many of the terms that are used for landscape features also are just as often used for small features. So the word for a gorge is the same as the word for a crack in the sidewalk. And the context tells people what kind of thing they were referring to. Now, toponyms, also known as place names or names of geographic features, refer to specific places or features. The idea of proper nouns is that they might be purely referential and purely a way to refer to that feature and do not have to be semantically meaningful, but they often are, and that sort of confuses things a bit. And I will be coming back to these topics again, and this may not be the best way to present this material, but this is what I'm doing today. Objectively, scientifically, much of the landscape, I claim, can best be conceptualized as a continuum, particularly elevations. And yet, at least in our culture, people often see or conceptualize the landscape as being composed of or populated by features or objects, such as hills or valleys. The people we work with in Australia don't seem to have a word for valley. They talk about the slopes and the stream bed, but not the whole thing. And valleys are immaterial. Valleys are not made of anything. Hills, it's hard to deny the existence of something there, although I've published a paper, one of my most prominent papers is entitled "Do Mountains Exist?" And I believe that the answer is no, but it depends on what you mean by exist. Anyway, this tendency to see objects, is that a sort of artifact of so-called Western thought, of Western Europe scientific way of viewing things? There's suggestions in the experts in the literature suggest that seeing categories that are mutually exclusive for many domains is a Western thought thing, and many cultures have a more blended idea of kinds. So there's also a question that we have not addressed really at all in our group's research, is whether the carving of individual entities out of the continuum, how much that interacts with the categories. So if I say it's a hill, will you find a different boundary than if I say it's a mountain? Or if I say to a German speaker, where's the edge of this Berg? So we don't know if there is, but it's at least a possibility. Landscape, as I kind of said, I'm not going to say much about that today. It's my idea of landscape is this largely perceptual, distant material that we can see in the environment, but not everyone would agree with that. Landscape terms vary semantically from language to language, meaning that the meanings do not always or do not often line up exactly. So although in Spanish class or German class you might have learned the words, the translations word by word, that may work pretty well for some domains. It does work to some extent for landscape for certain closely related languages in similar environments, but it doesn't, it's not a thing that can be generalized. So we found with the Australian language, Yinjibarndi, and with Navajo that there's almost no one-for-one translation. So when we list a word in our dictionary, we have to explain the meaning with quite a few words. And we try to avoid putting the English word there as the meaning of the indigenous word. Toponym practice, naming practices for proper names also vary considerably culturally. Toponyms in European languages, with some exceptions, usually have a generic part. So most lakes in English have the word lake in their name. Not quite all, but there are languages that do not use generic parts. So the proper names of features in our Australia area do not give you a clue as to what kind of thing they're referring to. But they can add an entity type word to reduce ambiguity. So they can talk about, and often the names refer to areas, and they can talk about the something hill or the something pond or the something creek. There's a paper that I thought was great. I think Gaurav called it dense. And those are not mutually exclusive. A carefully worded dense paper can be great if you appreciate the topic and the material. A guy named Coates wrote an article with this one-word title, Properhood, and claimed that proper names are not a class of words, but are a role that some words play. I think I've got, well, so this is my point. I've now said it 3 times. Names can be purely referential. There are 2 great domains for proper names. So proper names are used for a lot of features in the landscape, and they're used for people. And then they're used for a few, like honorary people, like pets or boats, ships. But most proper names are not given, that, as far as I know, to doorknobs or chairs very often. And some people do name their cars. So there are communities that give a proper name, like the Brad in the insurance commercial, is the name of their car. And I've never done that. It didn't seem like something, I don't have that kind of relationship with my car, but some people, I guess, do. Now, this, it's been pointed out, I'll put up the guy's name as well. Stephen Levinson claims that because we have dedicated regions of our brain that deal with places and with faces, that the people and places have proper names also. He thinks that's not a coincidence, that they are topics that have particular attention built into our brain wiring structure, and that he thinks that's why proper names are common in those two domains and not very common in other domains. Okay, geographic categories. Is this a meadow, a field, or a vacant lot? And Bill Keene has used this sort of joke at least 3 times in different domains. So there's is this a couch, a sofa, or a Chesterfield sort of thing with a furniture question. But then we might see over on the side a sign that says it's the Nellie Gall Ranch. So is it a ranch? If its name is really Nellie Gall Ranch, does that make it a ranch? Or is it still a vacant lot? Or does that matter, or who gets to say that? Of course, one of the main purposes of language is to communicate. So if you say, I'll meet you at the vacant lot down the street, and you walk right by it because it's a meadow or a ranch, you won't meet the person. So there's a requirement for a certain amount of agreement on meanings before the communication really works. So I've already said some of this, so I'll skip ahead. Landscape terms, common nouns, referring to kinds of things, and different languages classify it differently. Here's an old example that I showed at a conference in 1993, and I didn't follow it up for about 10 years in terms of research, and then I started researching this topic. Here's a sort of a schmap, a cartographic cartoon with some dimensions, attributes of water bodies that we could pay attention to. There's size from large at the top of the screen to small down at the bottom. Sorry about man-made, I did make this slide in '93. So human artifact, and then parts of the sea or ocean that are separated from the rest of the ocean by a barrier. And in English, lake is used in most parts of the English-speaking world. Lake refers to larger freshwater bodies, and lagoon is used primarily for features divided from the sea by some sort of sediment barrier. So there's the blue lagoon type, and there's the coastal lagoons, such as the one at Santa Barbara campus. There's also sewage lagoons. That's the euphemism to try to make a sewage treatment pond less noxious, I guess, by calling it a lagoon. Ponds are, in most of the English-speaking world, small. They may or may not need to be artificial. French has a word étang that refers to a broader range of things. So anything that's a pond in English probably will be an étang in French. But the coastal lagoons, separated by a barrier bar, a gravel bar, a sandbar, are also étang. And reasonably large, sort of swampy lakes are also called etang. And this is used both in toponyms and in regular speech. And it seems that, well, all ponds are etang, but not all etang are pond. The main defining characteristic of an etang is the absence of a surface outlet. So the big etang near, the number of them near Lyon are kettle lakes. So they're water table lakes that have no surface outlet, the coastal ones also. English does not pay attention to the presence or absence of surface outlets in water bodies. So that's not a distinction that's needed for deciding which term to use in English. French also, another case in French, also pays attention to the flows into, the sort of proper French rivers that flow into the ocean are fleuves, rivers that flow into another river are rivières, and they're defined again by what's at the downstream end, and the distinction is not as inherent in English terminology. And I should make one disclaimer here that I have not done any cognitive experimental work with French and English with respect to these. So these claims are my inference from dictionaries and experience in the field. But if we were trying to translate the word etang in a French document into English, we need to know what the thing is like before we can pick the right word to use. And that sort of, I think that there are practical important implications in this sort of observation for spatial data infrastructures, for things that have features and categories. Most of those spatial data infrastructures, the entities have types. And in gazetteers, the thing printed at the back of an atlas that says what's in the atlas and where it is and what it is, again, those entity types are important. And the geographic names information system has the name, what county it's in, the coordinates, and also has the one of 72 types of entities that a name can be referring to. If those entity types do not translate very well from one language to another, that suggests that users who are trying to use the same database but who speak a different language might have trouble finding the things they're looking for. Okay, ethnophysiography, Gaurav mentioned. That's a term that my colleague Andrew Turk and I coined in 2003. It has a fair number of occurrences on Google that were documents that I did not write, so it has caught on a little bit. It's intended to be the landscape equivalent of ethnobotany. So ethnobotany studies the terms and names and also traditional uses of plants across cultures. And an assumption that the uses and the names would divide things up differently makes ethnobotany an important field for documenting the conceptual systems of other cultures. And we discovered with the Australia work that such differences were going on for landscape features. So ethnophysiography studies how people conceptualize landscapes, especially natural landforms and water bodies. Some might object, some have objected to my attempt to separate natural from other, that the parts of the landscape that have been produced directly by human action we haven't studied yet, and some would say everything's been affected by human action and there's not really anything natural. The nature society separation is not accepted by everybody. The ethnophysiography to us consists of 5 interrelated topics. the one landscape categories that I've mentioned, and toponyms is another, but also the role of landscape in indigenous knowledge. Also topophilia, the whole idea of people's attachment to places and to geography, and how the emotional and affective aspects of human thought relate to place. And indigenous geographic information systems. So I probably don't need to say too much. I really like the diagram I did at the top. Those profiles, the top one is in our Yinjibarndi country in Western Australia, and the lower one is on the Navajo reservation. And the subsets were carefully chosen to look similar. But it seems that a lot of things about the landscape that's physically there are similar, and yet the conceptualizations sometimes are quite different. So this is the Ethnophysiography research team, and that's David Stay in the middle, and Andrew Turk, and our primary Navajo consultant, Carmelita Tapaha. Let's see, I'm getting an indication of time remaining that means I will have to do a little skipping, and I'll waste some of my own time to point out to people, you can skip in a PowerPoint by typing the number of the slide into the keyboard and hitting return. So you don't have to exit and go to the slide sorter, and I hand wrote a list of topics and numbers so that I could do this. So for a while I didn't know that. And it is, if you're good at practicing the talk and getting the timing right and sticking to that with an audience, you don't need to be able to do this. But this is slide, 27 out of 71. So you're not going to see my whole talk today. U.S. stream generics. As I said already, most natural feature names in English have a generic part, such as hill or river. There's a classic paper in cultural geography, Wilbur-Zielinski, 1955, in the Annals of AAG, entitled Some Problems in the Distribution of Generic Terms in the Place Names of Northeastern United States. And compiling his study was very tedious. I would guess that students did most of the tedious part, but they counted names per quad sheet and aggregated those up and did maps. Now with the Geographic Names Information System, a competent person with the touch of a button can produce maps like this. And this is creek and brook. So every orange dot represents some feature in the Geographic Names Information System whose name includes the word creek. And the blue dots represent places that have features called brook. And the black dots, you probably can't see them, there are places or quad sheets that have both. So they're sort of mixed area. So brook is clearly a New England sort of thing, except for a little bit of the upper Mississippi and sort of Wisconsin, Minnesota border. There's a bunch of brooks for some reason. And probably some of you can, I guess this is parts of Indiana have little clusters of brooks. This map, which won't show up very well in this lighting, has about 12 stream generics, not including river or creek. So the pinkish area that you might be able to see around here is run. And somebody was already pointing out earlier today that there are lots of runs here. The reddish thing just south of there is branch as a dominant term, and the brook areas there. The yellow in the Arizona and around there is arroyo. No, well, actually it's wash. So this is branch versus fork. So the reddish things are fork. And there are scattered forks all over the west, and then there's a concentration here in southeastern Ohio. This one, there's a whole bunch of these. This is the last one I'll show. This is Brook, Branch, and Run. And a guy named Paul Fly, F-L-Y, has a website that has a bunch of these maps on that he drew just retrieving from GNIS. Now we often interpret these sorts of things as related to the ethnicity of the settlement history, that like the area of Kills is where the Dutch people settled in the Catskills and other parts of northern Appalachia. But in Britain, there's also concentration of particular terms. This was just on Atlas Obscura 3 weeks ago or so, about mapping the UK's many, many names for streams. And again, this slide is probably kind of washed out there. This brownish area in Scotland is a term called Alt with 2 L's, A-L-L-T. Anybody heard of that as a stream name? I had not heard of that at all, but apparently most of the streams names in that part of northwestern Scotland are Alt. And these are maps of the separate. Burn is the top middle one. Afon, probably related to the River Avon, is a Welsh term, apparently. So again, these might relate to ethnic and linguistic history in England, but that's going a lot further back. And this one is lake names across England. I'm, 5 minutes? Toponyms and Properhood. This is a feature on the Navajo reservation whose English name is the Hogback. But in Navajo, its proper name refers to rock sloping in some way. True toponyms are proper nouns. They might be purely referential. They do not need to make sense, but they might make sense to varying degrees. I've said that too many times. This is a first page of the Coates paper on Properhood, referencing, that's the same point again, sorry. Landmark names often contain a greater degree of meaning compared to people's names. This is one of the few papers on the psychology of place names, experiments run by psychologists Hollis and Valentine. And then there's the Mount Pleasant effect, which was alluded to earlier. There's 157 Mount Pleasants in the Geographic Names Information System. 76% are not mounts. They're populated, they're towns or villages. And I leave it to you to decide which of those are pleasant and which are not. I hope there's no one being directly insulted. Well, you can believe if you're from one, you probably think it is pleasant, or that's why you're not there anymore if you think it's not. So I would like to keep this more or less on time. So I'm going to jump ahead again. I'm going to skip the Indonesia, Malaysia toponyms for hills and mountains and the Swiss toponyms and go directly, I think. This is one of the photos of the country I was working with in northwestern Australia. It's tropical hot desert. The question, what is a river? The Oxford English Dictionary says that a river is a large natural stream of water flowing in a channel to the sea, a lake, or another usually larger stream. If a river is a stream of water, then if the water disappears, like it might around Phoenix, Arizona, the river should be considered to be absent. But and I haven't done the experiment yet, but I think most people would say the river is dry, that it's still there. But if it's still there but dry, the river could not have been the water, right? So what's going on here? And people manage to talk for decades about rivers in the desert without having to face this sort of thing. I got undergrads, I did have IRB permission from the ethics board to do these questionnaires, asked them for parts of a river, and a lot of them did say water, bed, banks, source, mouth. So the river probably is thought of as a complex of elements, and but the dry lakes, places. So is the Oxford English Dictionary wrong? SDTS from the U.S. multi-agency government stuff is actually really good on this. It's a course or a way through which water may or does flow. So the water course can be dry, and the water course is the place where the flow sometimes or always happens, and river is coded as a water course. But waterfall is coded not as a place, but as the descent of water. So again, we would have the problem of, is the waterfall, well, maybe it's not a problem. Is the waterfall there when there's no water? Yeah, so we did field work in northwestern Australia. We drove from Perth. Each time it's 1,000 miles. We did a stop halfway up in Carnarvon, and we talked for the 2 days about what research we were going to do. We worked with the people. We took a group of old women from the town out to the countryside, maybe 20 miles out of town, and we put on a barbecue, and then we gathered around the old esky, as they call them in Australia, the cooler, and showed photos of their country, their landscape, and had an audio recording and asked them what they saw in the picture, talk about what was there. I was getting nervous about the time probably, but this is this was, Ned Chidi was the oldest living speaker at the time, age somewhat indeterminate, but probably in his 90s. So we went through these photos, same photos, with actually only 4 different groups, sort of focus groups of elders, and then we made some conclusions. Now, we showed some pictures of waterfalls from other parts of the country. In Indobarni country, the surface streams never flow except when a hurricane, a cyclone, comes in, and then you get 10 inches of rain in 24 hours and everything flows. So they have a word yindi, which means to descend and remain in sight. So if we push them, what do you call this? They would say bawa yindi, water descending and remaining in sight. But then we found out that let's see, I'll skip a little more. That's a wundu is an arroyo, a stream bed, a place where water sometimes flows horizontally. We eventually discovered what this word means. Thardar refers to a place where waterfalls sometimes happen. And the water, Yijirdi is a slow trickle of flow, and Mankurdu is a rushing, dangerous, strong flow. And here's a Yijirdi that's vertical. There's Yijirdi horizontal or vertical, or just still Yijirdi, and Mankurdu, this big waterfall up in Kakadu National Park near Darwin, also they said Mankurdu. So we are pretty certain that the Indobarni people talk about the places, basins, conduits, whatever, and the water separately. And that's much more like how a hydrologic engineer would talk about it. This mess that English and other European languages are that sort of confounds the bed, the banks, the water, and everything else is This is much more clean and much closer, I think, to a scientist's objective view of the reality. So I think this is the summary of the overall talk. Naming is an important aspect of how people interact with their environments at a landscape scale, and maybe not so much at the proximal scale of personal spaces and indoor spaces. Landscape naming can be specific, naming a place such as Bloemer, Berg, or generic, the word hill. Landscape naming practices and semantics vary considerably across languages and cultures. Digital resources exist for investigating these variations. So there's really interesting studies that you can do from the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency maintains a worldwide database of names of features, and they have a code of what the DMA operator thought they were when they coded the map, as well as the name and so on. So there's a lot that can be done within the US. It would be Geographic Names Information System. So there are many research opportunities. Also field work, which is tedious and expensive, is also very rewarding to go and work with people and actually do ethnographic interviews and so on. So thank you very much for your attention and for inviting me here.
Staying, it's 5:10. I mean, we'll take questions, and you have to leave. I'm sure nobody would mind. Any questions for Omar? Young?
Hi, thanks a lot. I'm Young Kim in geography here. I teach economic and urban geography, and I like your talk. So that you talked about these naming places, and some interactions and all that. But let's see. A lot of place names or even physical geography, those names could be made accidentally. You see, so rather than some purposeful kind of act or process of naming this particular place, but there could be a lot of arbitrary names
yes.
or accidents or so. That's why I think that you put too much meaning on certain names, but 100 years ago, that place with that river might have been named very arbitrary, or as a kind of a one-time thing, rather than any kind of consistent process or coding there.
Yeah, but if we, that's true to a considerable extent, I guess. But as people moved west in the United States and started naming and recording things, that I don't think it was random. There was an arbitrariness, but they had to use their own vocabulary or ask the native guide what you call this. And I think there are patterns to be found, even if they're sort of statistical. So absolutely, I wouldn't want to generalize from one name or 5 names, but the degree people have constructed pre-settlement land use in Hawaii from the traditional Hawaiian names for places, and they contained often, but not always, indications of what crops were grown there. So there are also, sometimes the names are from a previous language. So around Buffalo, there are a lot of names from the Iroquoian native people in that area, and one of them translates to the place where the wild cherries grew, and there's some possibility to reconstruct vegetation from the names, but the names could have been arbitrary, they could have been ironic. We know of 2 things called Little Mountain. There's probably dozens. And if it's little, it couldn't be really a mountain, but its name. So was that a joke or a pun? Or somehow the people around there started calling it that, and then at some point the surveyors and mappers come and ask locals, what do you call this? And there's these examples of, like, I think kangaroo means I don't know, or there's some examples like that where they ask what was that, and the person says I don't know, but the explorer thinks it's the name of that kind of animal. And whether any of those stories are true, and also place names. Nome, Alaska, the name Nome comes from the cartographer writing no name on the manuscript, and then when it got back to USGS, or Coast and Geodetic Survey, it got drafted into as Nome, N-O-M-E. So it is said, but is that a rural legend of some sort, an Arctic myth? So yes, there's a lot of, it's not very deterministic, of course, and I think most of the time the names, the generic part of the names are truthful. The person who told the surveyor the name of the creek, that it really is called something Run, and that the local people talked about it that way. But it's good. There's quite serious limits to doing this by data mining of these gazetteers, a large data set with this kind of uncertainty and slippage in it. You can probably get a lot better result from field interviews, but as I said, they take time, money, and patience, and but they're really fun. And the Hugh Bloemer's love of travel would fit into this kind of field work and so on.
Yeah, so I read a book many years ago called Slide Mountain by Ted Steinberg. I wasn't sure if you were familiar with that.
Thanks.
And
no, I'm not.
he talks about a court case in Louisiana, and what was writing on the court case was if this body of water was a lake, then the recently discovered oil deposits would be owned by the state. If it was determined it was a river or a stream, then it would be opened to corporations to drill. And this went on forever. You'd think you'd know the difference between a lake and a river, but there was virtually no current, and they went back and forth. They had all these scientists looking at it, and they could not determine it. Ultimately, they said it's always been called a lake, so it's a lake.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering if you ever came across cases like that where it came down literally to a place name in a legal.
Yeah, there are cases that I've heard about, at least two. I mean, in that case, maybe it was a bayou, and a bayou is neither or both lake and river, but how the law of land applies to bayous might be vague. There's lots of problems with land boundaries in Australia because they try to use British law, which assumes permanent streams. And so the way rivers are written into the law about cadastral boundaries. But there's a place, one of my projects that may or may not ever get finished is a book of 100 geographical oddities. And there is a place, a city in the Pyrenees that is a Spanish city entirely surrounded by France. And it's called Livia. And there's a gap of 5 miles maybe between this patch and the rest of Spain. And it stayed as part of Spain. There was a treaty where all of the villages in this valley were ceded, given up to France. And 50 years later, they argued that, well, Livia was not a village. It was a city, so it's still Spanish. And the power had changed enough that Spain was able to maintain that thing. I know there's another one with the Santa Clara Pueblo Reservation near Santa Fe, I guess. Or yeah, it's a bit up river from Santa Fe, where there was a court case about the boundary of the reservation of how it related to the boundary of a Spanish land grant. And they were debating again, what did the words in the Spanish land grant actually refer to, because the land grant preempted the native claims, which seems wrong, but that's the way the law was being interpreted. But what did the Spanish crown give to the Spanish person? And that would be not part of the res. And so I imagine this happens quite often, where in meets and bounds descriptions of property, you use thence westward along the bank of the creek, and it may be that which creek or whether it was a creek would be ambiguous. And I think it has to be done on a case-by-case basis. They're trying to guess, make an educated guess about what the people writing the deed meant. And it was written in Spanish in 1650 in what is now New Mexico for the Santa Clara case. I think the tribe sort of won the case. They got a larger amount of land due to successfully arguing that the Spanish writing did not mean that this whole valley was in the land grant. So yeah, it's again a good topic. You might, if you work at it, be able to make some money being an expert witness on this sort of case if you're really an expert and want to do that.
I think there was something else in Australia. There's a paper on the semantics of a river, and it was actually an actual case in Australia.
Okay, I know of two papers about this issue of cadastral boundaries and state boundaries and dry rivers, and it's sort of a, I probably pointed you at that article, although you may have found a different one or may have found this independently, but the same guys, I think they were geographers, wrote two papers about the implications of English common law being applied in a desert when shores of water bodies are in the common law. What's that going to mean?
Any more questions? Yeah.
Thank you very much for your interesting talk. So your talk was focusing on how landscape naming is diverse. But what does the difference mean? I understand landscape naming is very diverse. It's very multilingual. But what does the difference mean? For example, in British English and American English, blah blah blah.
Well, I think the effect of it could be communication problems and could be problems in legal documents, as he just asked. Whether it actually, in any sense, means that people think differently about the things, and that's why the words are different, I don't know. I happen to think that would need studies with human participants to get 30 people or 100 people to make judgments, and we see whether there's a difference depending on which word we use, and whether there's a different. I just got an article to review about people claiming they found a difference in figure ground interpretation of diagrams for people speaking two different languages. They tested the same diagrams and asked this, but you can't actually ask the same question in two different languages. So the control that a psychologist would want to have is not quite possible because the queries aren't exactly translatable. And we ran into cases like that. We asked for examples of something physical, but physical, there's at least 3 different Spanish words which pick out the physical of physics, the physical as in material, or physical as in exercise and workouts. And when we just asked for something physical, we got totally different lists depending on whether we said a physical object or which physical word we use. And that's not quite right. In English, physical gets different lists in different contexts. But whatever word we used in Spanish, we got the same list in different contexts because the word physical that we chose was constraining the way we answered. So the sort of denotational and connotational meaning, of course, the connotational meaning could be quite different even within a single language in different, like for hipsters or for NASCAR dads. They might have different meanings of the same word. And so that would be a cultural difference, I guess.
The only thing I was going to say, since we're walking over to Baker Center, what do you do when a river gets rerouted?
Well, if this was private property around there, that might be a serious issue. If the course of the river was in the deed, they've rerouted the Rhine quite drastically as it comes out of Liechtenstein and runs between Switzerland and whatever's east of that, into Lake Leman. So they didn't, in that case, move the international boundary to the new river course. So now the river is entirely in one of those countries, Austria, I guess. But along the Mississippi, a lot of the state lines don't follow the current river. They're winding where the river was when statehood was achieved for that state. And so the way the cadastre interacts with the physical reality, gradual change of the river position, the property line goes with it. But a sudden change, the property line stays where it was before. So I've got a whole book on how cadastral boundaries work. It's sort of a workbook for surveyors, how property boundaries work with water features in the United States. But is it the same river? And there's this thing, you can't swim in the same river twice because even if nobody moved it, the water has been replaced. And there's a lot of certain identity assumptions are made in certain contexts. So, but it's a good question, and there may be an answer. But if it's the campus all around that river, then maybe nothing happened in the legal parcel description.
Anybody else? So I have one question for Ray. Where is Bloemer Berg here? What were you thinking of? What is the feature? Because looking at this, it's not quite obvious actually.
It's not quite obvious. It is a high point right by his home.
Okay.
And it is a summit. It's not a mountain. You're right.
That's what we were thinking.
Pretty hilly over there if you've been in the top. Looking down on the hill.
Because it looks like
But
So
it's a high point you were focusing.
there's a small
B-U-R-G or B-E-R-G?
B-E-R-G.
Which
Yeah, B-U-R-G is a city.
is actually a mountain.
Yeah.
And a B-U-R-G is a fortress.
correct.
Right.
We know that. I mean, it's kind of a homophone. We call it Bloemer Berg because of the home that the community we have there. So we referred to it as B-U-R-G at that time. But since it was referring to the geographic feature, I went with the B-E-R-G.
So is it the one just to the
So yeah, you see the very top. See where the B is.
Right.
this closed contour?
So that's what we were focusing.
Is it this closed contour just west of? Yeah, that was my guess.
You're right.
I mean, there's
So when you were saying this is a hill, think about it now. The point of this is, I mean, a hill wouldn't be only that probably if we really think about it. So is it the top of that thing? And it's an open question. And who is named?
well, there's again the what is a hill?
Right.
Are there hills in the Texas Hill Country? The road goes up and down as you go across it, so there's hills along the road, but not many of them are closed contour features that are higher on all sides. So then what counts as a hill, and whether it matters or what you use it for. One of the beauties is the names on topographic maps are ambiguous as to exactly what's being referred to. So Bloemer Berg is somewhere near where the label is, and it's up to you to figure out what's being referred to. And I hadn't really thought of that till I started this project. Particularly for hills and valleys, they might be considered to have vague or transitional boundaries, probably not sharp boundaries. That's more stuff that I think needs experiments getting people to delimit the features. But delimiting on map is not like delimiting on the ground, but delimiting on the ground is sometimes too much energy is needed, or it might be dangerous if somebody's got a still on the other side and they don't want you going around the hill to delimit it. So again, there's lots of opportunities to learn a little bit more about what people think these terms mean and what they refer to and so on. The coordinates in the Geographic Names Information System will be the coordinates of where the name is placed on the map, and not necessarily the coordinates of the feature being referred to, right? Or
It is the feature, right, but the labeling was done for cartographic purposes.
right.
To expose the hilltop, so we can see.
Right, and if there's a lot of names, they crowd each other out and push each other away. They have to stay close to the feature, but they might go on the other side, and so on.
So in the interest of time, I think we should thank you and let you end this wonderful evening. Thank you to the speaker, thank you for everybody else. And I guess we have a reception after this at Baker.
1804 Lounge in Bakersfield.
Okay, 1804 Lounge, and you're welcome to join us there.
What level is that on?
Fifth floor. Take the escalator up.
You're the
And
top of the
then
river.
And then the stairs beyond that.
And the stairs beyond that. Thanks very much.